Hello, and welcome back to Storytelling Live. This is week 3 of Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. I hope you've seen the other two. That'd be nice. If you're not, if you haven't, I guess each one of these episodes is, somewhat independent, the one of the other. The point is to show in each episode a bit of background, a bit of cultural or modern relevance, if there is any. Of course, there is. But and then to present a couple chapters, And I can't read the thing. Can't read it verbatim, word after word, because it would take hours and hours and hours. But there are projects out there available where you can see the whole thing if you want. This is a project mostly to keep us company during lockdown and curfew during these COVID times. And hopefully soon enough, we won't be doing this anymore. We'll be able to go out and have an actual Saturday night. I hope. Tonight, okay, I said this last week, and I said this probably the week before. I like everything in the book, but tonight's another special night. And it's special to me for personal reasons, probably most particularly, because I lived for a time in France, in the north of France, and in Lille and in Paris. And I took a break from one of those cities and went out to visit some friends who were living in Alsace at the time. And I had never before been on skis. I have been on skis since, but I have not been on skis in many, many years. That doesn't matter. But where I learned to ski was Mont Blanc and at Chamonix. And it's above alpine level, so it's just beautiful trails across the Alps, and you just go, 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 and there's just, the view is, of course, stupendous. And Mary Shelley knows it, and she writes beautiful descriptions of the French Alps. But they are based in Switzerland, and so the perspective is Swiss Alps. I'm not sure how we get there to Chamonix, but we're going. And I remember Chamonix, the little village, was really cute and full of snow, and it was just awesome. And I think that was the first time ever. Well, that was the first time I tried a real French fondue. That was pretty crazy. Amazing. Emmentaler cheese and Gruyere all melted up together. Well, cold weather fun. Anyway, so I've got a few articles. We're going to talk a little bit about who Mary Shelley's mom and dad were, and what this little chalet or cabin or house on Lake Geneva, what it was called, and I think Byron was renting it, or Byron's family kind of owned it, or well, we're gonna find out. We're gonna talk about it a little bit, because I just always forget stuff. So. And if you need URLs, I will have these URLs ready for you in the comments section. Mary Shelley's brilliance was to realize that life itself, that which brings us joy, that enables human existence as such, is also the fundamental source of horror, and to locate a new originator of that horror in the man of science who had come to symbolize European cultural and political domination. So, stories of the ill effects of human and most often male hubris as it transgressed religious and cultural prohibitions had been universal staples of myth and literature, from Adam and Eve to the original Prometheus to Oedipus to Milton's Satan. Victor Frankenstein translates that drive and its consequences, this, I guess, male urge to control nature, right? And its consequences to the realm of Western man's ostensibly unqualified strength, reason. So, I don't even know if I would agree with calling it reason. It's, they built up, like since Francis Bacon and these people determining the physical world. They make these postulates and theorems, and it's reason. But at the same time, I mean, in my opinion, it's kind of almost, an artificial lattice work of self referential postulates, theories. So, let's see. If Goya would imagine the sleep of reason as producing monsters, Shelley's insight was how reason, unchecked, could do so all the more. And that's a cool point. That's why I included that little bit there. And it's just, it's like manipulating the natural world, manipulating everything that one sees, feeling privileged enough to like manipulate whatever the natural world offers, because it's all now malleable now that we have this structure of theories and systems about the natural world. They had been hammering those out since the 15s, and now it was like the 18s, and they were like sure they were on something. Anyway, so science gone awry, and it's the it's the ultimate horror, right? So this one's from Wikipedia. Mary Wollstonecraft, April 1759 to September 1797, was an English writer, philosophy, and advocate of women's rights until the late 20th century. Wollstonecraft's life, which encompassed several unconventional personal relationships at the time, received more attention than her writing. Today, Wollstonecraft is regarded as one of the founding feminist philosophers, and feminists often cite both her life and her works as important influences. During her brief career, she wrote novels, treatises, a travel narrative, a history of the French Revolution, a conduct book, and a children's book. Wollstonecraft is best known for A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which she argues that women are not naturally inferior to men, but appear to be only because they might lack education. She suggests that both men and women should be treated as rational beings and imagines a social order founded on reason. Nothing short of absolute appropriate genius. After Wollstonecraft's death, her widower, that's William Godwin, published a memoir of her life, revealing her unorthodox lifestyle. But she had different lovers, Why not? She reminds me so much of Emma Goldman, if you know her story. But so Mary. Anyway, I'm just going to read the writing here. However, with the emergence of the feminist movement at the turn of the 20th century, Wollstonecraft's advocacy of women's equality and critiques of conventional femininity became increasingly important. And that also, side note, reminds me of the union of Alice B. Toklas, Gertrude Stein, and Emma Goldman. After two ill-fated affairs with Henry Fuseli and Gilbert Imlay, by whom she had a daughter, Fanny Imlay, Wollstonecraft married the philosopher William Godwin, one of the forefathers of the anarchist movement. Nothing less than anarchy, baby. Wollstonecraft died at the age of 38, leaving behind several unfinished manuscripts. She died 11 days after giving birth to her second daughter, our favorite writer and author, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley, who would become an accomplished writer and author of Frankenstein. William Godwin, 1756 to 1836, was an English journalist, political philosopher, and novelist. He's considered one of the first exponents of utilitarianism and the first modern proponent of anarchism. Godwin is most famous for two books he published within the space of a year: An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, An Attack on Political Institutions, and Things as They Are, or The Adventures of Caleb Williams, an early mystery novel which attacks aristocratic privilege. Based on the successes of both, Godwin featured prominently in the radical circles of London in the 1790s. He wrote prolifically in the genres of novels, history, and demography throughout his life. In the conservative reaction to British radicalism, Godwin was attacked, in part because of his marriage to the feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft in 1797, and his candid biography of her after her death from childbirth. The candid biography, again, is the memoir that we just mentioned. Their daughter, later known as Mary Shelley, would go on to write Frankenstein and marry the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. With his second wife, Mary Jane Clairmont, Godwin set up the juvenile library, allowing the family to write their own works for children, sometimes using a nom de plume, and translate and publish many other books, some of enduring significance. Godwin has had considerable influence on British literature and literary culture. Godwin came to London in 1782, still nominally as a minister, to regenerate society with his pen, a real enthusiast who never shrank from conclusions of the premises which he laid down. He adopted the principles of the encyclopedists, and he believed, however, that calm discussion was the only thing needful to carry every change. That's what I wanted to say. He believed, however, that calm discussion was the only thing needful to carry every change. From the beginning to the end of his career, he deprecated every approach to violence. Okay. Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, was the daughter of radical philosopher William Godwin, who described her as singularly bold, somewhat imperious, and active of mind. Her mother, who died days after her birth, was the famous defender of women's rights, Mary Wollstonecraft. So these are separate articles that I put together, so it's kind of repeating, but you get it. Mary grew up with the 5 semi-related siblings in Godwin's unconventional but intellectually electric household. At the age of 16, Mary eloped to Italy with the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, who praised the irresistible wildness and sublimity of her feelings. Each encouraged the other's writing, and they married in 1816, after the suicide of Shelley's wife. They had several children, of whom only one survived. And then the fateful night, the ghost story writing contest on Lake Geneva, 1816, that inspired Frankenstein, is often called the first true work of science fiction. Superficially a Gothic novel, and influenced by the experiments of Luigi Galvani, Galvanism, baby, it was concerned with the destructive nature of power when allied to wealth. Whoa. The destructive nature of power when allied to wealth. It was an instant wonder and spawned a mythology all its own that endures to this day. After Percy Shelley's death in 1822, she returned to London and pursued a very successful writing career as a novelist, biographer, and travel writer. She also edited and promoted her husband's poems and other writings. So let's talk about this place where they were. The Villa Deodati is a mansion in the village of Colony near Lake Geneva in Switzerland, notable because Lord Byron rented it. Okay. And stayed there with Polidori in 1816, of course, with Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe, and they had rented a house nearby. Okay, so Mary and Percy were nearby, and they were frequent visitors. Because of poor weather, that's the surprise thunderstorm that turned into terrible wet summer. In June 1816, the group famously spent 3 days together inside the house, creating stories to tell each other, 2 of which were developed into landmark works of the Gothic horror genre: Frankenstein, by our buddy, and The Vampire, by Polidori. Okay. So, I stopped last week in the middle of Chapter 7. So, here's Chapter 7. Continued. So this is the night when he was out walking alone outside town. He'd almost made it back to his family's home. And he is out there in the rain. Well, he's out there looking at how beautiful the lake is at night. And then he's watching the lightning flash, and it like flashes up the surface of the lake and bounces against, lightning up on the tops of the Alps. And the storm kicks up, and the rain kicks down. And he's getting wet, and he doesn't care. And off in the distance, he happens to see it's the creature hanging around. And actually, he went to scan the site of his little baby brother's death. Not baby brother, his brother's he has a very young brother, about 7 years old or something. And so he sees the creature off in the distance. And he's like, I know you're the one who killed William. And he's pretty upset. He's like, oh my God, I'm going to go home. I'm going to tell Dad. Oh my God, I can't tell Dad. I mean, is he ever going to believe me that I created this monster, this creature, this thing that came back here, found our home, found my little brother, and then killed him? Nobody's going to believe me. They're going to think I'm insane, especially because he said he was having an episode. He was. And that's when Clairvaux was taking care of him, so he was a little bit out of his mind. And so he's walking back up to his home. It was about 5 a.m. when I entered my father's house. I told the servants not to disturb the family, and went into the library to attend their usual hour of rising. Okay, so he's going to go wait for the family to wake up in the library. And again, remember, the part of the device is to demonstrate the wealth of this family and sort of the privilege and the power of reason that Victor feels he has conquered, and it's going to bite him in the butt. Basically, in my opinion, if we can remember that scene where the creature finds him in his bedroom, chases him back through the house. Well, it was a chase, not a chase. He just walks, and then he finds him later on. He's like, "Oh, I found you. Hey, come." And he's actually trying to smile, and he holds out his hand. Wait, don't run, man. I'm going to be cool. He just was trying to make friends, man. He's trying to make friends. And Victor, the chicken, runs away. And so the monster says, okay, man, I'm going to get you, and I'm going to get everything you love. So, otherwise, they could have been friends, right? 6 years had elapsed since he was gone, passed as a dream, but for one indelible trace, and I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father before my departure for Ingolstadt. Beloved, and venerable parent, he still remained to me. I gazed on the picture of my mother, which stood over the mantelpiece. It was an historical subject, painted at my father's desire, and represented Caroline Beaufort in an agony of despair, kneeling by the coffin of her dead father. And her garb was rustic, and her cheek pale, but there was an air of dignity and beauty that hardly permitted the sentiment of pity. Below this picture was a miniature of William, and my tears flowed when I looked upon it. While I was thus engaged, Ernest entered. He had heard me arrive, and hastened to welcome me. He expressed a sorrowful delight to see me. "Welcome, my dearest Victor." He's a little boy. "Welcome, my dearest Victor," said he. "I wish you had come 3 months ago, then you would have found us all joyous and delighted. You come to us now to share a misery which nothing can alleviate, yet your presence will, I hope, revive our father, who seems sinking under his misfortune, and your persuasions will induce poor Elizabeth to cease her vain and tormenting self-accusations. Poor William, he was our darling and our pride." Tears, unrestrained, fell from my brother's eyes. A sense of mortal agony crept over my frame. Before, I had only imagined the wretchedness of my desolated home. The reality came on me as a new and a not less terrible disaster. I tried to calm Ernest. I inquired more minutely concerning my father, and her I named my cousin. "She most of all," said Ernest, "requires consolation. She accused herself of having caused the death of my brother, and that made her very wretched. But since the murderer has been discovered—" "The murderer? Discovered? Good God, how can that be? Who could attempt to pursue him? It is impossible. One might as well try to overtake the winds or confine a mountain stream with a straw. I saw him too. He was free last night." "I do not know what you mean," replied my brother, in accents of wonder. "But to us the discovery we have made completes our misery. No one would believe it at first, and even now Elizabeth will not be convinced notwithstanding all the evidence. Indeed, who would credit that Justine Moritz, who was so amiable and fond of all the family, could suddenly become capable of so frightful, so appalling a crime? Justine Moritz, poor girl! Is she the accused? But it is wrongfully. Every one knows that. No one believes it, surely, Ernest?" "No one did at first, but several circumstances came out that have almost forced conviction upon us, and her own behavior has been so confused as to add to the evidence of facts a weight that, I fear, leaves no hope for doubt. She will be tried today, and you will then hear all." He related that the morning on which the murder of poor William had been discovered, Justine had taken ill, and confined to her bed for several days. During this interval, one of the servants, happening to examine the apparel she had worn on the night of the murder, had discovered in her pocket the picture of my mother, which had been judged to be the temptation of the murderer. The servant instantly showed it to one of the others, who, without saying a word to any of the family, went to a magistrate, and upon their deposition, Justine was apprehended. On being charged with the fact, the poor girl confirmed the suspicion in a great measure by her extreme confusion of manner. This was a strange tale, but it did not shake my faith, and I replied earnestly, "You are all mistaken. I know the murderer. Justine, poor, good Justine, is innocent." At that instant, my father entered. I saw unhappiness deeply impressed on his countenance, but he endeavored to welcome me cheerfully. And, after we had exchanged our mournful greeting, would have introduced some other topic than that of our disaster, had not Ernest exclaimed, "Good God, Papa! Victor says that he knows who was the murderer of poor William." "We do also, unfortunately." I should probably start doing the accents. "We do also, unfortunately," replied my father, "for indeed I had rather I'd had rather have seen forever ignorant than have discovered so much depravity and ingratitude in one I valued so highly. My dear father, you are mistaken. Justine is innocent. If she is, God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. She is to be tried today, and I sincerely hope, that she will be acquitted. This speech calmed me. I was firmly convinced in my own mind that Justine, and indeed every human being, was guiltless of this murder. I had no fear, therefore, that any circumstantial evidence could be brought forward strong enough to convict her. My tale was not one to announce publicly. Its astounding horror would be looked upon as madness by the vulgar. Did anyone exist except I, the Creator, who would believe, unless his senses convinced him, in the existence of the living monument of presumption and rash ignorance which I had let loose upon the world? We were soon joined by Elizabeth. Time had altered her since I last beheld her. It had endowed her with loveliness surpassing the beauty of her childish years. There was the same candor, the same vivacity, but it was allied to an expression more full of sensibility and intellect. She welcomed me with the greatest affection. "Your arrival, dear cousin," said she, "fills me with hope. You perhaps will find some means to justify my poor guiltless Justine. Alas, who is safe if she be convicted of crime? I rely on her innocence as certainly as I do upon my own. Our misfortune is doubly hard to us. We have not only lost that lovely darling boy, but this poor girl, whom I sincerely love, is to be torn away by even a worse fate. If she is condemned, I never shall know joy no more. If she is condemned, I never shall know joy more. But she will not. I am sure she will not. And I will be happy again, even after the sad death of my little William." "She's innocent, my Elizabeth," said I, "and that shall be proved. Fear nothing, but let your spirits be cheered by the assurance of her acquittal." "How kind and generous you are! Every one else believes in her guilt, and that made me wretched, for I knew it was impossible, and to see every one else prejudiced in so deadly a manner rendered me hopeless and despairing." She wept. "Dearest niece," said my father, "dry your tears. If she is, as you believe, innocent, rely on the justice of our laws and the activity with which I shall prevent the slightest shadow of partiality." And here we're going to skip the trial of Justine. Eek. Because I wanted to get out to Chamonix. I'm sorry. There's probably like 100 of you like tuning out right now. I don't mean to cheat you. If you want to see that, all you have to do is look up. You got a few chapters to read, because I'm picking up at chapter 9. It's all the talk and back and forth, and with the magistrate and the legal, right? Stick with me, man. Stick with me, because this is a fun part, and no wonder I'm fast forwarding to it. It's cool. Remember, this is just to whet your appetite for the book. You can go ahead and grab that book and read it up and read everything about it on your own. But this is just a little taster. That's all. Chapter 9. Nothing is more painful to the human mind than after the feelings have been worked up by a quick succession of events, the dead calmness of inaction and certainty which follows, and deprives the soul both of hope and fear. Justine died. She rested, and I was alive. The blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed on my heart which nothing could remove. Sleep fled from my eyes. I wandered like an evil spirit, for I had committed deeds of mischief beyond description horrible, and more, much more, I persuaded myself, was yet behind. Yet my heart overflowed with kindness and the love of virtue. I had begun life with benevolent intentions and thirsted for the moment when I should put them in practice and make myself useful to my fellow beings. Now all was blasted. Instead of that serenity of conscience which allowed me to look back on the past with self-satisfaction and from thence to gather promise of new hopes, I was seized by remorse and a sense of guilt which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures such as no language can describe. The state of my mind preyed upon my health, which had perhaps never entirely recovered from the first shock it had sustained. I shunned the face of man. All sound of joy or complacency was torture to me. Solitude was my only consolation, deep, dark, death-like solitude. My father observed with pain the alteration perceptible in my disposition and habits, and endeavored by arguments, deduced from the feelings of his serene, conscious, and guiltless life, to inspire me with fortitude, and awaken in me the courage to dispel the dark cloud which brooded over me. "Do you think, Victor," said he, "that I do not suffer also? No one could love a child more than I loved your brother." Tears came into his eyes as he spoke. But is it not a duty to the survivors that we should refrain from augmenting their unhappiness by an appearance of immoderate grief? It is also a duty owed to yourself, for excessive sorrow prevents improvement or enjoyment, or even the discharge of daily usefulness, without which no man is fit for society. This advice, although good, was totally inapplicable to my case. I should have been the first to hide my grief and console my friends if remorse had not mingled its bitterness and terror, its alarm, with my other such sensations. Now I could only answer my father with a look of despair and endeavor to hide myself from his view. About this time, we retired to our house in Bellerive. This change was particularly agreeable to me. The shutting of the gates regularly at 10 o'clock, and the impossibility of remaining on the lake after that hour had rendered our residence within the walls of Geneva very irksome to me. I was now free. Often, after the rest of the family had retired for the night, I took the boat and passed many hours upon the water, sometimes with my sails set. I was carried by the wind, and sometimes after rowing into the middle of the lake, I left the boat to pursue its own course, and gave way to my own miserable reflections. I was often tempted, when all was at peace around me, and I the only unquiet thing that wandered restless in a scene so beautiful and heavenly, except some bat or the frogs, whose harsh interrupted croaking was heard only when I approached the shore. Often, I say, I was tempted to plunge into the silent lake, that the waters might close over me and my calamities forever. But I was restrained when I thought of the heroic and suffering Elizabeth, whom I tenderly loved, and whose existence was bound up in mine. I also thought of my father and surviving brother. Should I, by my base desertion, leave them exposed and unprotected to the malice of the fiend, whom I had let loose among them? At these moments, I wept bitterly, and wished that peace would revisit my mind, only that I might afford them consolation and happiness. That could not be. Remorse extinguished every hope. I had been the author of unalterable evils, and I lived in daily fear, lest the monster whom I had created should perpetrate some new wickedness. I had an obscure feeling that all was not over, and that he would still commit some signal crime, which by its enormity should almost efface the recollection of the past. There was always scope for fear, so long as anything I loved remained behind. My abhorrence of this fiend cannot be conceived. When I thought of him, I gnashed my teeth, my eyes became inflamed, and I ardently wished to extinguish that life which I had so thoughtlessly bestowed. When I reflected on his crimes and malice, my hatred and revenge burst all bounds of moderation. I would have made a pilgrimage to the highest peak of the Andes, could I, when there, have precipitated him to their base. I wished to see him again, that I might wreak the utmost extent of abhorrence upon his head, and avenge the deaths of William and Justine. Our house was the house of mourning. My father's health was deeply shaken by the horror of recent events. Elizabeth was sad and desponding. She no longer took delight in her ordinary occupations. All pleasure seemed to her sacrilege toward the dead. Eternal woe and tears, she then thought that was the just tribute she should pay to innocence so blasted and destroyed. She was no longer happy. She was no longer that happy creature who in earlier youth wandered with me on the banks of the lake and talked with ecstasy of our future prospects. The first of those sorrows which are sent to wean us from earth had visited her, and its dimming influence quenched her dearest smiles. "When I reflect, my dear cousin," said she, "on the miserable death of Justine Moritz, I no longer see the world and its works as they were before, as they appeared before to me. Before, I looked upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I read in books or heard from others as tales of the ancient days, or imaginary evils. At least they were remote, and more familiar to reason than to the imagination. But now misery has come home, and men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood. Yet I am certainly unjust. Everybody believed that poor girl to be guilty. Everybody believed that poor girl to be guilty, and if she could have committed the crime for which she suffered, assuredly she would have been the most depraved of human creatures. For the sake of a few jewels, to have murdered the son of her benefactor and friend, a child whom she had nursed from his birth, and appeared to love as if it had been her own. I could not consent to the death of any human being, but certainly I should have thought such a creature unfit to remain in the society of men. But she was innocent. I know, I feel she was innocent. You are of the same opinion, and that confirms me. Alas, Victor, when falsehood can look so like the truth, who can assure themselves of certain happiness? I feel as if I were walking on the edge of a precipice, towards which thousands are crowding and endeavoring to plunge me into the abyss. William and Justine were assassinated, and the murderer escapes. He walks about the world free, and perhaps respected. But even if I were condemned to suffer on the scaffold for the same crimes, I would not change places with such a wretch." I listened to this discourse with the extremest agony. I, not in deed, but in effect, was the true murderer. Elizabeth read my anguish in my countenance, and kindly taking my hand, said, "My dearest friend, you must calm yourself. These events have affected me, God knows how deeply, but I'm not so wretched as you are. There is an expression of despair and sometimes of revenge in your countenance that makes me tremble. Dear Victor, banish these dark passions. Remember the friends around you, who center all their hopes in you. Have we lost the power of rendering you happy? Ah, while we love, while we are true to each other, here in this land of peace and beauty, your native country, we may reap every tranquil blessing. What can disturb our peace? And could not such words from her, whom I fondly prize before every other gift of fortune, suffice to chase away the fiend that lurked in my heart? Even as she spoke, I drew near to her, as if in terror, lest that very moment the destroyer had been near to rob me of her. Thus not the tenderness of friendship, nor the beauty of earth, nor of heaven, could redeem my soul from woe. The very accents of love were ineffectual. I was encompassed by a cloud which no beneficial influence could penetrate. The wounded deer, dragging its fainting limbs to some untrodden brake, there to gaze upon the arrow which had pierced it, and to die, was but a type of me. Sometimes I could cope with the sullen despair that overwhelmed me, but sometimes the whirlwind passions of my soul drove me to seek by bodily exercise and by change of place some relief from my intolerable sensations. It was during an access of this kind that I suddenly left my home, and bending my steps toward the near alpine valleys, sought the magnificence, the eternity of such scenes, to forget myself and my ephemeral, because human, sorrows. My wanderings were directed toward the valley of Chamonix. I had visited it frequently during my boyhood. 6 years had passed since then. I was a wreck. But naught had changed in those savage and enduring scenes. I performed the first part of my journey on horseback. I afterwards hired a mule, as the more sure-footed and least liable to receive injury on these rugged roads. The weather was fine. It was about the middle of the month of August, nearly 2 months after the death of Justine, that miserable epoch from which I dated all my woe. The weight upon my spirit was sensibly lightened as I plunged yet deeper into the ravine of Arve. The immense mountains and precipices that overhung me on every side, the sound of the river raging among the rocks, and the dashing of the waterfalls around, spoke of a power mighty as omnipotence, and I ceased to fear or bend before any being less almighty than that which I had created and ruled the elements here displayed in their most terrific guise. Still, as I ascended higher, the valley assumed a more magnificent and astonishing character. Ruined castles hanging on the precipices of the piny mountains, the impetuous Arve, the cottages every here and there peeping forth from among the trees, formed a scene of singular beauty, but it was augmented and rendered sublime by the mighty Alps, whose white and shining pyramids and domes towered above all, as belonging to another earth, the habitations of another race of beings. I passed the bridge of Pelissier, where the ravine which the river forms opened before me, and I began to ascend the mountain that overhangs it. Soon after I entered the valley of Chamonix. This valley is more wonderful and sublime, but not so beautiful and picturesque as that of Serval, through which I had just passed. The high and snowy mountains were its immediate boundaries, but I saw no more ruined castles and fertile fields. Immense glaciers approached the road. I heard the rumbling thunder of the falling avalanche, and marked the smoke of its passage. Mont Blanc, the supreme and magnificent Mont Blanc, raised itself from the surrounding aiguille, and its tremendous dome overlooked the valley. A tingling, long-lost sense of pleasure often came across me during this journey. Some turn in the road, some new object suddenly perceived and recognized reminded me of days gone by, and were associated with the light-hearted gaiety of boyhood. The very winds whispered in soothing accents, and maternal nature bade me weep no more. And then again, the kindly influence ceased to act. I found myself fettered again to grief, and indulging in all the misery of reflection. Then I spurred on my animal, striving so to forget the world, my fears, and more than all, myself, or in a more desperate fashion, I alighted and threw myself on the grass, weighed down by the horror and despair. At length, I arrived at the village of Chamonix. Exhaustion succeeded to the extreme fatigue of both body and mind, which I had endured. For a short space of time I remained at the window, watching the pallid lightnings that played above Mont Blanc, and listening to the rushing of the Arve, which pursued its noisy way beneath. The same lulling sounds acted as a lullaby to my too keen sensations. When I placed my head upon my pillow, sleep crept over me. I felt it as it came, and blessed the giver of oblivion. Chapter 10. I spent the following day roaming through the valley. I stood beside the sources of Averion, which take their rise in a glacier with slow paces advancing down from the summit of the hills to barricade the valley. The abrupt sides of vast mountains were before me, the icy wall of the glacier overhung me. A few shattered pines were scattered around, in the solemn silence of this glorious presence chamber of imperial nature was broken only by the brawling waves or the fall of some vast fragment. The thunderous sound of the avalanche or the cracking reverberated along the mountains of the accumulated ice which, through the silent working of the immutable laws, was ever and anon rent and torn as if it had been but a plaything in their hands. These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was capable of receiving. They elevated me from all littleness of feeling, although they did not remove my grief, they subdued and tranquilized it. In some degree, also, they diverted my mind from the thoughts over which it had brooded for the last month. I retired to rest at night. My slumbers, as it were, awaited on and ministered to by the assemblance of grand shapes which I had contemplated during the day. They congregated round me. The unstained snowy mountain top, the glittering pinnacle, the pine woods, and ragged bare ravine, the eagle soaring amidst the clouds, they all gathered round me and bade me be at peace. Where had they fled when the next morning I awoke? All of soul-inspiring fled with sleep, and dark melancholy clouded every thought. The rain was pouring in torrents, and thick mists hid the summits of the mountains, so that I even saw not the faces of those mighty friends. Still, I would penetrate their misty veil, and seek them in their cloudy retreats. What were rain and storm to me? My mule was brought to the door, and I resolved to ascend the summit of Mont Blanc. I remembered the effect that the view of the tremendous and ever-moving glacier had produced upon my mind when I first saw it. It had then filled me with a sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul, and allowed it to soar from the obscure world to light and joy. The sight of the awful and majestic in nature had indeed always the effect of solemnizing my mind and causing me to forget the passing cares of life. I determined to go without a guide, for I was well acquainted with the path, and the presence of another would destroy the solitary grandeur of the scene. The ascent is precipitous, but the path is cut into continual and short windings, which enable you to surmount the perpendicularity of the mountain. It's a scene terrifically desolate. In 1,000 spots the traces of the winter avalanche may be perceived, where the trees lie broken and strewed on the ground, some entirely destroyed, others bent, leaning upon the jutting rocks of the mountain, or transversely upon other trees. The path, as you ascend higher, is intersected by ravines of snow down which stones continually roll from above. One of them is particularly dangerous, as the slightest sound, such as even speaking in a loud voice, produces a concussion of air sufficient to draw destruction upon the head of the speaker. The pines are not tall or luxuriant, but they are somber, and add an air of severity to the scene. I looked on the valley beneath, Vast mists were rising from the rivers which ran through it, curling in thick wreaths around the opposite mountains, whose summits were hid in the uniform clouds, while rain poured from the dark sky, and added to the melancholy impression I received from the objects around me. Alas, why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent to the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free. But now we're moved by every wind that blows, and a chance word or scene that word may convey to us. We rest. A dream has power to poison sleep. We rise. One wandering thought pollutes the day. We feel, conceive, or reason, laugh or weep, embrace, fawn, woe, or cast our cares away. It is the same. For be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure still is free. Man's yesterday may ne'er be like his morrow. Naught may endure but mutability. It was nearly noon when I arrived at the top of the ascent. For some time I sat upon the rock that overlooks a sea of ice. A mist covered both that and the surrounding mountains. Presently a breeze dissipated the cloud, and I descended upon the glacier. The surface was very uneven, rising like the waves of troubled sea, descending low and interspersed by rifts that sink deep. The field of ice is almost a league in width, but I spent nearly 2 hours in crossing it. The opposite mountain is a bare perpendicular rock. From the side where I now stood, Mont Blanc was exactly opposite, at the distance of a league, and above it rose Mont Blanc, in awful majesty. I remained in a recess of the rock, gazing on this wonderful and stupendous scene. The sea, or rather the vast river of ice, wound among its dependent mountains, whose aerial summits hung over its recesses. Their icy and glittering peaks shone in the sunlight over the clouds. My heart, which was before sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I exclaimed, "Wandering spirits, if indeed ye wander, and do not rest in your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me as your companion away from the joys of life." As I said this, I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance advancing toward me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt faintness seize me, but I was quickly restored by the cold gale of the mountains. I perceived, as the shape came nearer, sight tremendous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait his approach, and then close with him in mortal combat. He approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish, combined with disdain and malignity, while his unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes. But I scarcely observed this. Rage and hatred had at first deprived me of utterance, and I recovered, only to overwhelm him with words expressive of furious detestation and contempt. "Devil!" I exclaimed, "do you dare approach me, and do not you fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Begone, vile insect, or rather, stay, that I may trample you to dust, and oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered." "I expected this reception," said the demon. "All men hate the wretched. How, then, must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you My Creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You purpose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty toward me, and I will do mine toward you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death till it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. Abhorred monster! Fiend that thou art, the tortures of hell are too mild a vengeance for thy crimes, wretched devil! You reproach me with your creation. Come on, then, that I may extinguish the spark which I so negligently bestowed. My rage was without bounds. I sprang on him, impelled by all the feelings which can arm one being against the existence of another. He easily eluded me and said, "Be calm. I entreat you to hear me before you give vent to your hatred on my devoted head. Have I not suffered enough that you seek to increase my misery? Life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember, thou hast made me more powerful than thyself. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple, but I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if thou wilt also perform thy part, the which thou owest me, O Frankenstein. Be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice, and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which alone I am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. Be gone! I will not hear you. There could be no community between you and me. We are enemies. Begone, or let us try our strength in a fight in which one must fall. How can I move thee? Will no entreaties cause thee to turn a favorable eye on thy creature, who implores thy goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity, but I am not alone. But am I not alone, miserably alone? You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains and dreary glaciers are my refuge. I have wandered here many days, the caves of vice, which I only do not fear, are a dwelling to me, and the only one which man does not grudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your fellow beings. If the multitude of men knew of my existence, they would do as you do, and arm themselves for my destruction. Shall I not then hate them who abhor me? I will keep no terms with my enemies. I am miserable, and they shall share my wretchedness. Yet it is in your power to recompense me, and deliver them from an evil which it only remains for you to make so great that not only you and your family, but thousands of others shall be swallowed up in the whirlwinds of its rage. Let your compassion be moved, and do not disdain me. Listen to my tale. Would you have heard that? Abandon or commiserate me, as you shall judge that I deserve. But hear me. The guilty are allowed, by human laws, bloody as they are, to speak in their own defense before they are condemned. Listen to me, Frankenstein. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature. Oh, praise the eternal justice of man. Yet I ask you not to spare me. Listen to me, and then, if you can, and if you will, destroy the work of your hands. Why do you call to my remembrance, I rejoined, circumstances of which I shudder to reflect that I have been the miserable origin and author? Cursed be the day, abhorred devil, in which you first saw light. Cursed, although I curse myself, be the hands that formed you. You have made me wretched beyond expression. You have left me no power to consider whether I am just to you or not. Begone! Relieve me from the sight of your detested form. Thus I relieve thee, my Creator, he said, and placed his hated hands before my eyes, which I flung from me with violence. Thus I take from thee a sight which you abhor. Still thou canst listen to me, and grant me thy compassion. By the virtues that I... So he covers his eyes. He's like, now you can't see me. So now I have relieved you of that wretched sight by covering your eyes. But listen, just listen to me. Thus I take from thee a sight which you abhor. Still thou canst listen to me, and grant me thy compassion. By the virtues that I once possessed, I demand this from you. Hear my tale. It is long and strange, and the temperature of this place is not fitting to your fine sensations. Come to the hut upon the mountain. The sun is yet high in the heavens, before it descends to hide itself behind yon snowy precipices, and illuminate another world. You will have heard my story, and can decide. On you it rests, whether I quit for ever the neighborhood of man, and lead a harmless life, or become the scourge of your fellow creatures, and the author of your own speedy ruin. As he said this, he led the way across the ice. I followed. My heart was full, and I did not answer him, but as I proceeded, I weighed the various arguments that he had used, and determined at least to listen to his tale. I was partly urged by curiosity, and compassion confirmed my resolution. I had hitherto supposed him to be the murderer of my brother, and I eagerly sought confirmation or denial of this opinion. For the first time also I felt what the duties of a creator towards his creature were, and I ought to render him happy before I complained of his wickedness. These motives urged me to comply with his demand. We crossed the ice, therefore, and ascended the opposite rock. The air was cold, and the rain again began to descend. We entered the hut, the fiend with an air of exultation, I with an heavy heart and depressed spirits. But I consented to listen, and, seating myself by the fire, which my odious companion had lighted, he thus began his tale. It is with considerable difficulty. This is the monster speaking, or the creature. I don't know how to. Hang on. It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. All the events of that period appear confused and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time. And it was, indeed, a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my various senses. By degrees, I remember, a stronger light pressed upon my nerves, so that I was obliged to shut my eyes. Darkness then came over me, and troubled me, but hardly had I felt this, when by opening my eyes, as I now suppose, the light poured in upon me again. I walked, and I believe, descended. But I presently found a great alteration in my sensations. Before, dark and opaque bodies had surrounded me, impervious to my touch or sight. But now I found that I could wander on, at liberty, with no obstacles which I could not either surmount or avoid. The light became more and more oppressive to me, and the heat wearying me as I walked. I sought a place where I could receive shade. This was the forest near Ingolstadt, and here I lay by the side of a brook, resting from my fatigue until I felt tormented by hunger and thirst. This roused me from my nearly dormant state, and I ate some berries, which I found hanging on the trees, or lying on the ground. I slaked my thirst at the brook, and then, lying down, I was overcome by sleep. It was dark when I awoke. I felt cold also, and half frightened, as it were instinctively, finding myself so desolate. Before I had quitted your apartment, on a sensation of cold, I had covered myself with some clothes, but these were insufficient to secure me from the dews of night. I was a poor, helpless, miserable wretch. I knew and could distinguish nothing, but feeling pain invade me on all sides. I sat down and wept. Soon a gentle light stole over the heavens, and gave me a sensation of pleasure. I started up, and beheld a radiant form rise from among the trees. I gazed with a kind of wonder. It moved slowly, but it enlightened my path, and I again went out in search of berries. I was still cold, when under one of the trees I found a huge cloak, with which I covered myself, and sat down upon the ground. No distinct ideas occupied my mind. All was confused. I felt light, and hunger, and thirst, and darkness. Innumerable sounds rung in my ears, and on all sides various scents saluted me. The only object that I could distinguish was the bright moon, and I fixed my eyes on that with pleasure. Several changes of day and night passed, and the orb of night had greatly lessened, when I began to distinguish my sensations from each other. I gradually saw plainly the clear stream that supplied me with drink, and the trees that shaded me with their foliage. I was delighted when I first discovered that a pleasant sound, which often saluted my ears, proceeded from the throats of the little winged animals, who had often intercepted the light from my eyes. I began also to observe, with greater accuracy, the forms that surrounded me, and to perceive the boundaries on the radiant roof of light which canopied me. Sometimes I tried to imitate the pleasant songs of the birds, but was unable. Sometimes I wished to express my sensations in my own mode, but the uncouth and inarticulate sounds which broke from me frightened me into silence again. The moon had disappeared from the night, and again, with a lessened form, showed itself, while I still remained in the forest. My sensations had, by this time, become distinct, and my mind received every day additional ideas. My eyes became accustomed to the light, and to perceive objects in their right forms. I distinguished the insect from the herb, and, by degrees, one herb from another. I found that the sparrow uttered none but harsh tones, while those of the blackbird and thrush were sweet and enticing. One day, when I was oppressed by cold, I found a fire, which had been left by some wandering beggars, and was overcome with delight at the warmth I experienced from it. In my joy, I thrust my hand into the live embers, but quickly drew it out again with a cry of pain. How strange, I thought, that the same cause should produce such opposite effects. I examined the materials of the fire, and to my joy found it to be composed of wood. I quickly collected some branches, but they were wet, and would not burn. I was pained at this, and sat still, watching the operation of the fire. The wet wood, which I had placed near the heat, dried, and itself became inflamed. I reflected on this. By touching the various branches, I discovered the cause, and busied myself in collecting a great quantity of wood that I might dry it, and have a plentiful supply of fire. When night came on, and brought sleep with it, I was in the greatest fear lest my fire should be extinguished. I covered it carefully with dry wood and leaves, and placed wet branches upon it, and then, spreading my cloak, I lay on the ground, and sunk into sleep. It was morning when I awoke, and my first care was to visit the fire. I uncovered it, and a gentle breeze quickly fanned it into a flame. I observed this also, and contrived a fan of branches, which roused the embers, where they were nearly extinguished. When night came again, I found, with pleasure, that the fire gave light as well as heat, and that the discovery of this element was useful to me in my food, for I found some of the offals that the travelers had left had been roasted, and tasted much more savory than the berries I gathered from the trees. I tried therefore to dress my food in the same manner, placing it on the live embers. I found that the berries were spoiled by this operation, and the nuts and roots much improved. Food, however, became scarce. I often spent the whole day searching in vain for a few acorns to assuage the pangs of hunger. When I found this, I resolved to quit the place that I had hitherto inhabited to seek for one where the few wants I experienced would be more easily satisfied. In this emigration, I exceedingly lamented the loss of the fire which I had obtained through accident, and knew not how to reproduce it. I gave several hours to the serious consideration of this difficulty, but I was obliged to relinquish all attempt to supply it, and, wrapping myself up in my cloak, I struck across the wood towards the setting sun. I passed 3 days in these rambles, and at length discovered the open country. A great fall of snow had taken place the night before, and the fields were of one uniform white. The appearance was disconsolate, and I found my feet chilled by the cold, damp substance that covered the ground. It was about 7 in the morning. How does he tell time? It was about. How does he know what time? It's about 7. It's like, tell time by the sun, Excuse me. It was about 7 in the morning, and I longed to obtain food and shelter. At length, I perceived a small hut on a rising ground, which had doubtless been built for the convenience of some shepherd. This was a new sight to me, and I examined the structure with great curiosity. Finding the door open, I entered. An old man sat in it, near a fire, over which he was preparing his breakfast. He turned on hearing a noise, and, perceiving me, shrieked loudly, and quitting the hut, ran across the fields with a speed of which his debilitated form hardly appeared capable. His appearance different from any I had ever seen, and his flight somewhat surprised me, but I was enchanted by the appearance of the hut. Here the snow and rain could not penetrate. The ground was dry, and it presented to me, then, as exquisite and divine a retreat as pandemonium appeared to the demons of hell after their sufferings in the lake of fire. I greedily devoured the remnants of the shepherd's breakfast, which consisted of bread, cheese, milk, and wine. The latter, however, I did not like. Then, overcome by fatigue, I lay down among some straw, and fell asleep. It was noon when I awoke, and allured by the warmth of the sun which shone brightly on the white ground, I determined to recommence my travels, and, depositing the remains of the peasant's breakfast in a wallet I found, I proceeded across the fields for several hours, until, at sunset, I arrived at a village. How miraculous did this appear! The huts, the neater cottages, and stately houses engaged my admiration by turns. The vegetables in the gardens, the milk and cheese that I saw placed at the windows of some of the cottages allured my appetite. One of the best of these I entered, but I had hardly placed my foot within the door before the children shrieked, and one of the women fainted. The whole village was roused, some fled, some attacked me, until grievously bruised by stones and many other kinds of missile weapons, I escaped to the open country, and fearfully took refuge in a low hovel, quite bare, and making a wretched appearance after the palaces I had beheld in the village. This hovel, however, joined a cottage of a neat and pleasant appearance, but, after my late dearly bought experience, I dared not enter it. My place of refuge was constructed of wood, but so low that I could with difficulty sit upright in it. No wood, however, was placed on the earth, which formed the floor, but it was dry, and although the wind entered it by innumerable chinks, I found it an agreeable asylum from the snow and rain. Here, then, I retreated, and lay down happy to have found a shelter, however miserable, from the inclemency of the season, and still more from the barbarity of man. As soon as morning dawned, I crept from my kennel, that I might view the adjacent cottage, and discover if I could remain in the habitation I had found. It was situated against the back of the cottage, and surrounded on the sides, which were exposed by a pigsty and a clear pool of water. One part was open, and by that I had crept in. But now I covered every crevice by which I might be perceived with stones and wood, yet in such a manner that I might move them on occasion to pass out. All the light I enjoyed came through the sty, and that was sufficient for me. Having thus arranged my dwelling, and carpeted it with clean straw, I retired, for I saw the figure of a man at a distance, and I remembered too well my treatment the night before to trust myself in his power. I had first, however, provided for my sustenance for that day by a loaf of coarse bread, which I purloined, and a cup with which I could drink more conveniently than from my hand of the pure water which flowed by my retreat. The floor was a little raised, so that it was kept perfectly dry, and by its vicinity to the chimney of the cottage it was tolerably warm. Being thus provided, I resolved to reside in this hovel until something should occur which might alter my determination. It was indeed a paradise, compared to the bleak forest, my former residence, the rain-dropping branches, the dank earth. I ate my breakfast with pleasure, and was about to remove a plank to procure myself a little water, when I heard a step, and looking through a small chink, I beheld a young creature, with a pail on her head, passing before my hovel. The girl was young and of a gentle demeanor, unlike what I have since found cottagers and farmhouse servants to be, yet she was meanly dressed, a coarse blue petticoat and a linen jacket being her only garb. Her fair hair was plaited, but not adorned. She looked patient, yet sad. I lost sight of her, and in about a quarter of an hour she returned, bearing the pail, which was now partly filled with milk. As she walked along, seemingly incommoded by the burden, a young man met her, whose countenance expressed a deeper despondence. Uttering a few sounds with an air of melancholy, she took the pail from her head and bore it to the cottage himself. She followed, and they disappeared. Presently I saw the young man again, with some tools in his hand, cross the field behind the cottage, and the girl was also busied, sometimes in the house, and sometimes in the yard. On examining my dwelling, I found that one of the windows of the cottage had formerly occupied a part of it, but the panes had been filled up with wood. In one of these was a small and almost imperceptible chink, through which the eye could just penetrate. Through this crevice a small room was visible, whitewashed and clean, but very bare of furniture. In one corner, near a small fire, sat an old man, leaning his head on his hands in a disconsolate attitude. The young girl was occupied in arranging the cottage, but presently she took something out of a drawer, which employed her hands, and she sat down beside the old man, who, taking up an instrument, began to play, and to produce sounds sweeter than the voice of the thrush or the nightingale. It was a lovely sight even to me, poor wretch, who had never beheld aught beautiful before. The silver hair and benevolent countenance of the aged cottager won my reverence, while the gentle manners of the girl enticed my love. He played a sweet mournful air, which I perceived drew tears from the eyes of his amiable companion, of which the old man took no notice until she sobbed audibly. He then pronounced a few sounds, and the fair creature, leaving her work, knelt at his feet. He raised her, and smiled with such kindness and affection that I felt the sensations of peculiar and overpowering nature. They were a mixture of pain and pleasure, such as I had never before experienced, either from hunger or cold, warmth or food, and I withdrew from the window, unable to bear these emotions. Soon after the young man returned, bearing on his shoulder a load of wood. The girl met him at the door, helped helped to relieve him of his burden, and, taking some of the fuel to the cottage, placed it on the fire. Then she and the youth went apart into a nook of the cottage, and he showed her a large loaf and a piece of cheese. She seemed pleased, and went into the garden for some roots and plants, which she placed in water, and then upon the fire. She afterwards continued her work, while the young man went into the garden, and appeared busily employed in digging and pulling up roots. After he had been employed thus about an hour, the young woman joined him, and they entered the cottage together. The old man had, in the meantime, been pensive, but, on the appearance of his companions, he assumed a more cheerful air, and they sat down to eat. The meal was quickly dispatched. The young woman was again occupied in arranging the cottage. The old man walked before the cottage in the sun for a few minutes, leaning on the arm of the youth. Nothing could exceed in beauty the contrast between these two excellent creatures. One was old, with silver hairs and a countenance beaming with benevolence and love. The younger was slight and graceful in his figure, and his features were molded with the finest symmetry. Yet his eyes and attitude expressed the utmost sadness and despondency. The old man returned to the cottage, and the youth, with tools different from those he had used in the morning, directed his steps across the fields. Night quickly shut in, but to my extreme wonder, I found that the cottagers had a means of prolonging light by the use of tapers, and was delighted to find that the setting of the sun did not put an end to the pleasure I experienced in watching my human neighbors. In the evening, the young girl and her companion were employed in various occupations which I did not understand, and the old man again took up the instrument which produced the divine sounds that had enchanted me in the morning. So soon as he had finished, the youth began, not to play, but to utter sounds that were monotonous, and neither resembling the harmony of the old man's instrument nor the songs of the birds. I since found that he read aloud, but at this time I knew nothing of the science of words or letters. The family, after having been thus occupied for a short time, extinguished their lights, and retired, as I conjectured, to rest. And that, my friends, concludes week 3 of Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, and we're hearing the monster's account and how he breaks out of the Ingolstadt and heads over, finds himself some enemies and finds some friends. And there's more of the monster's story next week. I hope you guys are happy, healthy, and warm. I'm gonna continue. I'll be gone. I'm not sure if this will air. This will air before my birthday, and then the next one will air after my birthday. I was born on the 21st of January. So you can write me and tell me happy birthday in the meanwhile. I'm going to do something pretty cool. I might tell you about it. Definitely write to me. Keep your little messages coming because I really enjoy it. Thank you. And it helps push me along further doing this thing. We're all keeping one another company in the kindest possible way. In peace and in health. I thank you very much for your participation once again. Thank you so much. Good night.